Hi, welcome to What's My Podcast. I'm Jen and I'm a library specialist for Arapahoe Library District. I love learning, and in the last couple years I've gravitated toward podcast listening for knowledge and entertainment. I spend time listening to different content and I'd love to share some suggestions with you. Today's segment is American history. My first podcast recommendation is Uncivil. This podcast put out 10 episodes of Civil War stories. It's hosted by journalists Jack Hitt and Chenjerai Kumanyika. Jack Hitt is an author and contributing editor to Harper's and This American Life. Chenjerai Kumanyika is a researcher, journalist, and works as an assistant professor at Rutgers University. Here, they ransack the official version of the Civil War and share untold stories about covert operations, corruption, resistance, mutiny, and more. This podcast is for you if you are interested in learning more detail about the Civil War and how it relates to life today. Next up is The Dollop. This is an American history comedy podcast with a liberal view on different people from the American past. It's hosted by Dave Anthony and Gareth Reynolds. Dave is a comedian, writer, and history enthusiast. Gareth is a comedian, writer, and producer. The Dollop has been putting out content since 2014 and gives a hilarious view of notable figures and events from history. This podcast is for you if you have a liberal view of history and want to hear some not-so-well-known details from the past. These episodes are going to be longer, running from 90 minutes to 2 hours. Next is the American History Podcast. It's going to offer the history of the United States in a scholarly and entertaining way. This podcast is hosted by Sean Warswick, who is a professional historian and teacher at Mission Early College High School. He's also working on his PhD in American history and American imperialism. This podcast is for you if you like history and want straightforward answers. Sean's topics are well-researched and presented in a simple format. Next up is the History Chicks. The goal here is to introduce you to female characters in history, factual and fictional. There will be an introduction, an overview, and a little push to explore and learn more on your own. It's hosted by Beckett Graham and Susan Vollenweider. Beckett is a researcher and producer. Susan is a freelance writer and a columnist for the Kansas City Star. This podcast will give you a short look at the life of the person, but as the hosts chat, the podcast episodes will go into greater detail about the challenges, failures, and successes, and any juicy tidbits they find. My last suggestion is Queer Serial, American LGBTQ History. Devlin Camp created this podcast to cover United States queer history before the Stonewall riots. Devlin Camp is a journalist, producer, and author of young adult fantasy fiction. This podcast is for you if you want to learn more about figures and events in queer history. Devlin also brings to light important issues facing queer kids today. There are so many podcasts out there, and sometimes it can take a while to find what you like. So definitely give it some time, but keep listening and keep searching. Another great way to browse in your podcast app is using keywords. For this category, some good keywords are American history, Civil War, or queer history. This topic is very broad and there are so many good podcasts out there. My research barely scratches the surface of what's available. I highly recommend you keep your ears open for more historical content. All these podcasts can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen.